has a monopoly on the truth. Our version of our own truths are based on our own lived experiences. In this space, we welcome different perspectives to learn, unlearn, and enlighten. Welcome to The Lantern. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Lantern podcast. I am delighted to be joined by Danielle, who is a registered therapist here in the UK. Danielle, welcome to The Lantern podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Khanyi.
So I usually like guests to introduce themselves because I do think there's so much power in you telling your own story. Who do you want the world to know who you are? So tell us about who you are.
So I am an integrative therapist and I specialize in a couple of modalities that I blend together to work with adult clients. And those modalities are psychodynamic, person-centered, and coaching. And so the psychodynamic part is about helping adults to understand their history, looking back, thinking about their childhood experiences and what might be locked away in their unconscious mind and bringing it up to the surface. The person-centered part is focusing on feelings and emotions and helping adults to understand what are they feeling now and how that plays a part in their healing and their experience. And then the coaching part is really about the actionable bits and pieces. And I decided to bring that in because I felt like it was missing from what I was doing. I work in quite a relational way. And so I was finding that we're doing a lot of digging and understanding, but then what happens once we understand all of this stuff? And so I blend all of those into a very integrated model of therapy.
Amazing, and so much to unpack from that. Let's go to your history, right? What drew you to therapy and why have you decided to focus on those three areas? Because in my views, it's quite unique. I haven't actually come across somebody who's blended these three modalities in the way that you have.
Yeah. So my working history is mainly within the criminal justice system. So for maybe just under 10 years, I worked within youth prisons, drug and alcohol services, social care, um, youth offending services, and forensic mental health, but all with adolescents. And I saw a lot working there. I worked in trauma-informed services, so where they put um, trauma kind of at the heart of what they do. So to understand behavior through the lens of needs, which was great. But I think just working in those establishments made me question a lot. I didn't love how punitive the criminal justice system was, especially for young people, and just didn't feel like it was giving young people what they needed in order to limit their reoffending and to be able to, I guess, kind of create the lives that they wanted with the support that was necessary. I questioned that a lot throughout my time working in the criminal justice system. And so that led me to a point where I thought, okay, I'm in the forensic mental health team now. This is a prime opportunity for me to train in something that feels worthwhile and fulfilling for me. And that's what I did. And it's when I started to train to become a therapist.
It's very interesting. I would love to touch on the punitive nature of the criminal justice system, maybe from the lens of understanding why these children commit crimes or offenses at an early age. What are some of those underlying childhood experiences that maybe are the catalyst to children committing these offenses?
It's a big question. Because there are so, and I think that's the issue. It's so varied, and then we have this streamlined answer. You know, the answer is being rehabilitated within a system that just does not fit. It's not really fit for purpose. I mean, it doesn't meet the needs of individual children. Every single child is different and will have different adverse childhood experiences. So there will be some common factors that you find and that I will have witnessed. But it's really difficult to say that or, and I know that you're not asking me to, but to kind of put them in a bracket and say that this is the situation. But I think therein lies the issue,
Mm,
because the answers or the services that are on offer for these children aren't very varied at all.
mm,
And so there are underlying needs, and lots of systemic issues that just are being ignored.
mm,
And when you're not targeting the root causes, then it's very difficult to try and elicit change. And that's what's missing. So there will obviously be generational difficulties within the families of these children, but there are also systemic issues, within schools, and the racism that some of these children might face and how they're being treated, and
mm.
and it's kind of all combined in there.
Yeah.
And to kind of only have a couple of options, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work.
I love that you do not want to reduce, the categorization, because I do think that
Mm,
a lot of the healthcare system has reduced a lot of these symptoms that we find, just to put a label on it so we can move on, right? So adolescent child depressed, move on. We know that they're depressed,
yeah,
or, came from a single parent household. So,
yeah.
this might be the reason why. But I would love for you to touch more on the root cause. And why do
Mhm.
you think it's so important getting to the root cause of these underlying conditions that then
Yeah.
surface in adolescence and then make their way as they transition into adulthood?
Yeah, I feel like if I had to reduce it or like categorize it slightly,
Mm.
the most comfortable one for me to use would be something like developmental trauma,
Mm.
which might still be a bit too broad, but I feel like that encompasses the I suppose the needs of the child, because I feel like that's where it gets lost in translation sometimes, because developmental trauma can look like so many different things.
Mhm.
And then that can lead to inappropriate diagnosis of a mental health condition that a child does not have, but it's because they've had all of these adverse childhood experiences which have culminated into developmental trauma, but it's being missed. And now they
Yeah.
have a label,
Mhm.
right? And that label is something that professionals will see. And regardless of how much unconscious bias training professionals go on, they're still going to be judged for that label, and it follows them. So I think it's things like this. We're not looking at what's within that developmental trauma for that child and looking at those specific issues, whether it's around parenting or the experience of racism, or whether there's neurodivergence in there or whatever it might be. We're not unpicking those. We're just falling it up into something and saying, okay, this person has done this, and then we're going to judge them accordingly. We're missing out a huge part of dissecting, well, what needs aren't being met for this specific child,
Mhm.
because behavior is us just trying to get a need met. And in the criminal justice system, it's not seen in that way. And I understand most of the time there is a victim, and we have to think about public safety, but there's something missing. If we're
Yeah.
trying to reduce reoffending rates, we have to look at the individual and understand, what do they need. um, and not everyone will agree with this, but empathy is required for that.
Yeah.
They deserve to have empathy in order to move forward and not repeat the same things that they've been doing.
Do you think that every individual has development trauma? Or do you think that it's a certain category of kids, as you say, that have experienced certain circumstances in their early years?
Mm. My answer is going to be biased. I feel like a lot of things stem from developmental trauma.
Mhm,
And I know that not everyone will agree with that, but I will stand 10 toes down on that.
mhm,
And I feel like it's missed, because often if you take um, any diagnosis and trace the history back far enough, you will see that there is often something really distressing that has happened.
mhm.
And I believe that that contributes significantly to, I guess, the choices that we make. That changes our brain chemistry. It changes the way that our brain develops. It changes the size of our brain. So I think to discount it um, wouldn't be sensible.
Hmm.
And I believe that a lot of it lands on the distress, early distress, and these adverse childhood experiences.
So, when we talk about this early distress, right? I guess would that look different for different people? Because I think, like, as you've mentioned, like, I think racism is an obvious one that, if you've grown up around people that don't look like you, then the propensity of you experiencing racism would be a lot higher. But let's
Mm,
say and I don't want to call it the average experience because everyone's experience is different, but let's say
yeah.
outside of that, what are some of these other development traumas that people can experience growing up?
Mm. So, neglect, I think, is another huge one. So the neglect that a child might experience from their primary caregivers,
Mm.
and not just their primary caregivers. I feel like the experience within systems, so in school, is a huge one. You spend so much time with your peers. So how you are treated by other people, whether you feel like you're accepted, whether you have community, do you feel supported? Are you isolated? So all of those things are a part of that. Um, Drugs and alcohol, is that a part of your experience as a child? And how that plays out for you? Again, how you're in terms of like neurodivergence and your neurological needs, and are they being met? Do the people around you understand the kind of person that you are, and how you learn, and what you might need in order to grow and flourish, or are those needs not being met? So I think there are a number of different elements. Strip it right down. Are your basic needs met? Do you have enough food?
Mm.
What's your diet like? Are you getting enough sleep? And so all of these things kind of combined, I see them as yeah, contributing to that experience for people.
That's very interesting. Can you maybe unpack just like a timeline of what it would look like for somebody who's maybe experienced this development trauma, how it's impacted them, whether that's brain chemistry wise, psychologically, how they where they find themselves in adulthood when it comes to just mental health, and maybe how they navigate the world, maybe giving us more color in how these issues then find themselves present in adulthood. Maybe what are some of the behaviors that one can experience at an adult level when those go ignored for quite a long time?
Mm. So the one that comes to mind, and I think is quite common, I think a lot of people might resonate with, is and it might not be the most distressing one, but it's the one that comes to mind. So
Mm.
having an experience as a child where maybe you have parents who are preoccupied,
Mm.
and so it might not look like the kind of typical example of neglect that you would experience. You might actually go on in adulthood to say, I had an amazing childhood. I had the perfect childhood.
Mm.
But when you have parents who aren't able to give you the kind of attention that you need and require as a child, and that can feel like quite a lot as a child. And obviously you're not going to have the like frontal lobe necessary to understand or rationalize that your parents have to work and do all of these other things.
Mm.
But when you have that experience, what can often happen is you start to learn how you need to show up as a child in order to receive the love and care from your parents. And that will look different for everyone. So there's no one way that that will evolve. But you learn pretty quickly because your brain is developed for survival. It's not developed for happiness. And survival as a child means I need this person to look after me. How can I get that from them? And so as a child, you might start to learn, okay, I have to be the person my parents need me to be in
Mm.
order to receive love and care. And this will be an unconscious process. It won't be something that you're thinking about. And that's how you can start to move through life. And you will see it repeat in all of your relationships because our primary relationship with our parents or whoever's looking after us at the time that we're a child is the blueprint. That's the template for all of our relationships to come. And so as you go into school, you might realize that it's happening in friendships and that you're starting to kind of mold more than like finding your feet when you're going through that like identity finding process, which is during adolescence. And then into adulthood, you might see it in adult friendships and romantic relationships. You will absolutely see it play out in romantic relationships where you might start people pleasing.
Mm.
Um, or feeling like, well, my needs aren't met. I often do more for people than they do for me. And that's really frustrating. You know, people never show up for me. Why is this always happening? And often it can stem back to potentially parents being preoccupied or not feeling like you had enough. And so you learn, I need to be this person in order to receive this. And that's how the message can continue to the point where you're in adulthood and you're thinking, how have I ended up in a relationship where my needs are not met, but I'm persistently chasing? And it's a consistent process. And I just don't know how to get out of this because now your brain is telling you this is what love is, because that's what
Mm.
we learned here.
That's an amazing example, and I think it
Mm,
is one that will resonate.
yeah.
Um, how would one go about unpacking everything that you've said, right? Because obviously we understand that the barriers to accessing holistic health therapy,
Mm,
whatever sort of, mental health support, there's financial barriers, there's socioeconomic circumstances, and for some people, there's just the blatant unwillingness to,
yeah.
to admit that, look, there may be something wrong. And I think in my experience, I do think everybody has experienced trauma to a certain degree. So I don't think
Mm,
there's anybody who's exempt from doing the work.
yeah.
But what would you say is the best way to go about maybe addressing one's mental health journey and maybe understanding themselves a bit better?
I would say it's increasing your awareness. So being curious about the whys.
Mm,
So trying to understand your own behavior, and that will include just looking back ever so slightly. And that has to be done in a cautious way because everyone responds to remembering their history in different ways. For some people, it will feel safer, and for others, it just won't.
mm,
And it depends on what happened, your genetic makeup, your brain chemistry. You know, two people aren't the same. And so I feel like discernment will have to be used around that. But I would say that beginning to heal requires you being curious about why. It's the accountability part, kind of how am I feeding into this? What's happening? And these are difficult questions.
mm,
Um, I split it into two. I say accountability and compassion. I feel like you have to have both in order to do the work. So the accountability part is you being curious, like, why does this happen? What part am I playing in this? What patterns can I see? What do I notice about these relationships if we're sticking with this example? And being inquisitive, you know, and then tracing things back. You need compassion because whilst you're holding yourself to account, if you're saying, gosh, why have I done that? I need to stop doing this. You end up just accumulating evidence for like your core wounds, which is like, I'm not good enough. You know, I need to show up. I need to do better. I need to show up in a different way. And that can just compound this part.
mm.
So it's about finding a balance between accountability and compassion. I'd first say tracking back and having a think about where some of this might come from, but in a safe way. You have to feel safe in order to be able to do that.
Do you think with how we're living in modern times, we can get to that level of safety required to unravel?
I do. I feel like it's heavily dependent on some of the things I mentioned before. So, where you are at emotionally,
Mm,
but also who you're doing it with. Um, I feel like you have to be able to live in your body, be able to live in the present so that you can safely do these things. Because if remembering some of these past experiences is taking you outside of your body, and when I say that, what do I mean? Um, So you're kind of taking yourself out of like your window of tolerance. We all have this window of tolerance and it's different for all of us. But if it feels like actually remembering this is taking me up here, then
Mm.
that's not going to be healthy for you. So it's important that you are able to ground and like regulate your nervous system in order to be able to remember some of these things. And this will look different for everyone. But coming back to your question, I do believe that it's possible. It just depends on safety
Mm.
and the internal safety, but also that kind of communal safety of who you're doing this with.
Amazing. I love this word that you used, internal safety.
Mm,
How can we go about starting to create that internal safety? What are the practical steps one can take to create that?
mm. I think it starts with the grounding part. So being in tune with your body. I think that's a good place to start.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people um, can neglect this part of the work or are quite detached from this part of the work. But
Mm.
what we feel in our body is so important for healing work. And so many of us discount it. We talk a lot, but
Yes.
actually feeling emotions is discounted. So I would say feeling safe in our body means understanding what things feel like. So
Mm.
as you're going through day to day living your life and something happens and you realize you want to understand, where have I felt that in my body?
Mm.
What kind of physiological responses are coming up? What can I feel? And just taking a moment to be present and really in that moment.
That's you said so much in just that sentence, because I think with modern day living and how busy people are,
Mm,
there becomes this compound of ignoring those sensations and those feelings and
yeah,
sort of suppressing those emotions and carrying on, carrying on. So I would love you to speak more about what are the impacts of suppressing those emotions, because I think a lot of people are probably more on the suppression side of things versus being in more of a contemplative mindset and processing in real time.
yeah. I think it can lead to us getting stuck. And that's what I've seen as a therapist is that when we consistently use this like problem solving part of our brain um, and neglect the more creative and emotional and the nonverbal parts of our brain, we can get stuck and the same problems just persist.
Mm.
And the missing link is that we're not connecting that kind of left and right brain pathway. We're doing lots of left brain things and we're trying to intellectualize things.
Mm.
And then at the end of the day, wondering why am I still coming home and feeling sad or low, and I cannot seem to shift this. And it's because we're neglecting a whole like emotional circuit, and it's remaining underdeveloped. And I feel like it leads to us feeling stuck
Mm.
and unfulfilled. And we might feel like by talking things away and problem solving and getting things done and being super productive that this is moving forward. But in my experience, it's not very helpful at all. We can just end up in this quite frustrating loop
Mm.
because we're not strengthening those neural pathways that are necessary for us to be using all of the parts of our brain that we have access to.
Yeah, I mean, I really love what you've said there, and I think that, you know, people not necessarily realizing the detrimental impact that not implementing these contemplative practices can have, particularly around
Mm,
movement, because I think
mm,
people, as you say, it is a part that is bypassed, and particularly I think in like Western systems where there's a bit of an overemphasis placed on talk therapy,
yeah.
but not necessarily on movement. How do you think more movement can be integrated into the system? And I know that might be a big question to ask,
Yeah.
but how do you think that movement can start being integrated into any formal system?
Hmm. I feel like the first baby step is maybe just noticing to be able to emphasize it because
Mm.
many of us are kind of moving all of the time.
Mm.
And I think if you're intentional about your movement and present in that movement, then you can, I suppose, like change the meaning that it has and amplify it. Because we're moving, but we're probably moving to the productivity or moving to work. I think if you're present, then you can help those neural pathways form whilst you're doing the movement, if
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think I can't remember where I saw this, but there was a statistic recently that I saw online somewhere that says something like 60% of the time we're doing something and not thinking about the thing that we're doing.
Yeah.
We're thinking about something completely different.
Mm.
And when I heard that, I was I was peeling a satsuma, and I was like, "Gosh, it's true." But whilst I'm peeling this satsuma, I'm like looking at my phone, like, "Oh gosh, that's true." And then for a moment, I just stopped and just thought about how I was peeling the satsuma,
Mm.
and it changed the experience completely because I'm now using a different part of my brain. I'm now engaging my brain in what I'm doing, and so I feel like going back to your question, for me, it would be noticing. Just start by noticing. It's something small that you can do if you're just kind of noticing the movement, and then you can accentuate the movement as you're doing it to be
Yeah.
able to engage the parts of your brain that need to be engaged in order to kind of increase that part.
It's such a nice and simplistic example, and I think you're right. It is maybe just being a lot more conscious and just maybe the basic everyday activities that we engage in as a starting point,
Mm.
and then building that up. I am curious to get your opinion on what you think about holistic practices, mindfulness, yoga, meditation, breath work, and how you see them complementing therapy in this trauma work and healing.
Yeah, I think they're a necessity.
Can you
Um,
sorry, can you say that again louder?
yeah, I think they're an absolute necessity. um, they are so important, and as a therapist, I feel like they can feel quite polarizing sometimes, and they shouldn't.
Yeah.
They shouldn't,
Yeah.
because I think they need each other more than they know. You know, one is focused on the body, one is focused more on the mind, and they're kind of one and the same. And
Mm.
you need both of them. And I often find in therapy sometimes with clients when I'm like, well, we have talked about this for a long time. Well, you need to get in your body now, or get in your body whilst we're doing this, because
Yeah.
there's only so far all of the talking is going to take you.
Mm.
And especially if you're someone who intellectualizes a lot anyway
Mm.
and is really good at problem solving, because it will probably feel frustrating to a point for someone like that, where it's like, why can I not make this change? And sometimes the answer is, you need to move your body, practice some mindfulness, breath work, yoga. You need to get inside here, because yeah, those two things have to be connected.
I love that, but I think that when it comes to this mind-body connection, it's such an ambiguity because it's there's no scientific explanation for it. I think the
Right.
studies are not extensive enough or haven't gone deep enough to actually understand why that is the case. I think
Yeah.
that our inner engineering is very misunderstood. How do you start to research it, right? I'm not sure how those clinical trials or research groups, what they would look like, because it's a feeling. I think that's what makes people uncomfortable. In my experience is, when we start doing this somatic work, it's understanding that when you get into a certain posture and those then emotions arise,
Hmm.
most people get uncomfortable and they will back off, and then making them understand, no, that's the body keeping the score. And I don't
Yeah.
know if you've read the book, The Body Keeps
Yeah.
the Score. I mean, it's an absolutely amazing literature on just mind-body connection and understanding how
Hmm.
it's stored in the body. But in the spaces that I'm in, people have intellectualized mental health to an extent that I'm like, I think it's just about how you feel and not so much focusing on what's written down. And it's, as you
Yeah.
say, like, it's just coming back and realizing, okay, I've gone through the day. How did I feel? What's happened? And
Yeah.
maintaining that presence. But I think to some people, it's almost too simple. It's almost like you're tricking them when you say that.
Yeah.
Just be present.
Yeah. I feel like I agree with you on that one. I feel like people, especially today, need to have evidence and research in order to even try something.
Yeah.
And I guess there's this kind of this fixing culture. You know, I want the answers now, and
Mm.
so I want to know how to fix this so that I can get over here. But unfortunately, life just isn't like that. Um, and sometimes there's beauty in trying something different, especially if you've reached a block where it's like, well, I've been talking myself into oblivion. That what else can I do? You know,
Yeah.
go and start trying some somatic kind of work and just see how you feel. And it will feel uncomfortable for the people who are listening. If intellectualizing things and um, you know, you're into evidence and analysis, feeling will feel challenging for you.
Mm.
But this is how you create new neural pathways. It's coming out of your comfort zone so that you're creating like a new option. I often say to clients when talking about doing something new, and they'll say, but this, like, it's not working.
Mm.
If you imagine in terms of brain chemistry, you have option A, which is the thing you do all the time. We'll go back to the people pleasing. You
Mm.
know, in relationships, I can do this really well. It's the
Mm.
first option. So your brain is going to option A all of the time because there's a clear pathway. So in order for you to create option B and C, you're going to have to, if you imagine an overgrown garden, you're going to have to start cutting some weeds because right
Mm.
now that path doesn't exist. And that's what you're doing when you push yourself up out of your comfort zone. So that accountability part that I mentioned, you're
Mm.
cutting down the weeds. And even once you've cut the path still isn't very clear. So it's still going to feel uncomfortable. You might, you know, be pricked by some of the brambles along the way. But the more you do that,
Mm.
that path will become clearer. And I'd say the same with kind of somatic healing, getting comfortable and broadening like your window of tolerance. It's important.
Thank you. And I mean, you said that so beautifully. I love what you mentioned about just opening new pathways and like
Mm,
seeing it as like you can't keep going down the same pathway, but then you need to open up other pathways. I really think that
yeah,
that's well explained, and I'm hoping that those listening do understand what you mean.
yeah.
I would love to now touch on healing. I mean, I think we have sort of been discussing healing, but maybe not so much directly. What does
Mhm.
healing mean to you?
Heal is such a broad term and it's such a buzzword now as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, I think healing is an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process of knowing yourself better and being able to regulate yourself in a world that feels uncertain.
Mm.
That's what healing is for me,
Mm.
because I don't believe that any of us will get to a stage where nothing ever bothers us and some of these difficulties that we have experienced for decades completely vanish.
Mm.
The volume will be turned down on them for sure in the healing process, but they might always be there and kind of pop up. But through the healing journey, which is lifelong, we have the skills and the confidence in our ability to know I can manage this,
Mm.
and it will fluctuate and it will look different every day. I'm not going to feel happy all of the time, and sadness is there for a reason, and there's information in it. So I feel like healing is all of that combined for me.
I love that. And I love that you said it's a lifelong journey because I also do believe that. I
Mm,
think with for the intellectuals, they want to know like the start date, the end date, the project plan, the
yeah, yeah,
milestones.
yeah, yeah.
Whereas
And I get it.
yeah, whereas with healing it's not as clear cut and straightforward because you
No.
I find for me sometimes if you when you get re-triggered, that's when the test comes because you might think
Yeah.
that you're done with this, but then something comes up and you're like, actually now it's come up in maybe a different way. And then that's the challenging part of like, now I haven't had to consider this from this perspective. And then how do I now navigate that? And then it almost feels like being re traumatized. But if you've got the right coping mechanisms, and obviously you meet the moment and then you're able to regulate
Mm,
and then deal with it then. But I think that for those that intellectualize, it's wanting to have like the milestones of, am I healed now? And what about now? And how about now? And it's like, again,
yeah.
it's more like a feeling versus being like a formal timeline that you can sort of yes, you can sort of formulate.
Yeah.
What does mental health mean to you?
Oh, mental health, to me, I suppose in a similar vein, means how well we are looking after our emotional needs, um, how well we believe that we are functioning and being able to ride the wave of life, you know,
Mm,
that kind of fluctuations. I think mental health looks different over time. And sometimes the circumstances that you find yourself in, it's understandable why your mental health is suffering.
mm.
It would be normal for that to happen. So yeah, I feel like that one's quite difficult for me to answer. Um,
I love that it challenged you.
yeah.
Maybe you want to share, how do you take care of your own mental health? Because obviously, as someone in the working in this space,
Mm,
you obviously go through a lot on a daily basis. I personally
mm,
couldn't do your job because it would be too much for me energetically to take on everybody's problems on a daily basis. So how do
yeah.
you, I mean, I have a lot of questions, but like dissociate, I guess, at the end of the day between yourself and the job. And then how do you take care of yourself at the end of it all?
Um, so yeah, at the end of the day, I there is definitely a period of decompression where I'm like just sitting for a while. I
Mhm,
have children as well, so once they're in bed, it's like
mhm,
just sitting for a bit and taking stock of the day, where I'm at, how I feel, and just bringing myself back into my reality. Because
mhm,
you're right, as a therapist, you're kind of brought into people's worlds again and again every time you have a session. And so it's important to like reintegrate yourself back into your reality and what's happening in
mm,
the here and now. So that's really important for me. And I do that on a daily basis. If I zoom out slightly,
mm.
community, for me, that's really important. I love my people so much. And that is a priority for me, Kanye. Like, I will make time for the people around me, whether that's going out for dinner, whether it's kind of having lots of people over at my house. So I'm really big on, yeah, the people that I love and care about. And it doesn't have to be lots of people, but I just really value um, how they help me look after my mental health. And I see that I use them a lot for that. So there are
Mm,
moments when I like to be on my own and
mhm.
take stock of that, but there are also moments where like I love to have the people in my world around me and they really do uplift me and yeah, help me keep my mental health where I want it to be.
I love that. And do you want to share maybe a few of your favorite self-care practices in addition to community? Because of course that does count as one.
Yeah. Yeah. So journaling is one of them, even though I feel like everyone says journaling. It's like, don't say journaling, but it is. And maybe not in the kind of classic Dear Diary way that I feel like many of us believe journaling is, but just in taking a moment to like jot bullet points down.
Mhm,
Um, and as I'm feeling activated, do it in the moment. So journaling isn't something that I do every day,
mhm,
but in moments of high activation, absolutely. I'm jotting it down to understand what's going on and where is this coming from, because that helps to ground me.
mhm,
As someone who is really in tune with their emotions and can be very emotionally led,
mm,
I have to bring myself back down. Even as a therapist, I have
mm,
to bring myself back down. And so I like to journal things out and see, okay, what core wound is that? What's playing up here? Where is this coming from? What's my inner child saying to me?
mm,
And that really, really helps me to rationalize emotions. It gives me space to feel them, but it also helps me to understand, is this a historic emotional circuit and what's being activated? So that's what journaling means for me. And it's a
mm.
huge part of my self care outside of like community and just like daily reintegration.
I love that. And I wonder if you want to share maybe one journal prompt with people who are listening that maybe they can use on a daily basis just to get going. Because I think I get that question a lot of, what should I write about? It seems like you don't have
Mm,
your prompts. You're just able to put pen to paper and let it flow. But for those that are
yeah.
really are struggling to even start even just articulating what they're feeling, where do they even begin? What is a prompt that's easy to follow that they can just start with?
Yeah. For the moments when you're activated, so or triggered, I would say, is it what's coming up for me right now? Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes emotion recall can be quite difficult. So if you just broaden it out, what's coming up for me right now, and just start writing. Don't police yourself, don't filter yourself. Allow your unconscious to come through on that paper. What is coming up for me right now? And then
Mm-hmm.
the second question after that is, where have I felt this before?
Oh.
And that can help you like trace back. And that will
Mm-hmm.
potentially lead you to an older emotional circuit, which is where a lot of this stuff is hidden and comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also, using an emotions wheel is really helpful. So you
Mm-hmm.
can just type in on a search engine, wheel of emotions or feelings wheel, and it will give you language, because a lot of the time we use very simple language, which is understandable, sad, I feel good, I feel okay.
Mm-hmm.
But the emotions wheel really broadens out the language and vocabulary, and it will help you. So sometimes I'll have one of those with me or send them to a client, and you can use it with your journaling because it might help you to add depth and
Mm.
meaning to what emotions and feeling is coming up.
Oh, I love that idea of the emotional wheel because I think you
Mm,
are right. It has been said that we use very simplistic words to describe our feelings, and also that we haven't explored the full spectrum of our emotional body.
yeah.
So we have limited language, and that does keep people quiet. And I think there's also a level of perfectionism that plays into this journaling because there are some people that I've met that just want the perfect entry, and it's like this is not the
Yeah.
time. Like it's not gonna get graded. You just like
It's
need to
so
say how you're gonna
true.
feel. But yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like that perfectionism still comes, like, still plays up for people when they're journaling. So, what would be your advice to somebody who isn't a perfectionist, who wants to write the
Ooh.
most perfect dear diary because they believe this is going to be published? I don't even know by who.
Oh my God. It's so real though. Um, they won't like this advice, but start getting messy. Start getting messy. I think and as someone who would say they're like a recovering perfectionist, just start living in the gray and push yourself to show mess. And it doesn't have to be showing mess to everyone.
Mm,
Start with the journal because only you are going to see that, because
mm,
again, you're opening up or broadening your bandwidth and window of tolerance for discomfort. As a
mm,
perfectionist, it's uncomfortable to be seen, to be perceived, um, or to show up in a way that feels messy.
mm.
And that's what you want to do, is to start practicing showing up as human. So
Oh,
it might feel messy, but it's actually just humanizing yourself. So I would say start on something that feels like the risk is quite small. The
yeah,
stakes are low,
yeah.
on your own. In your journal is the perfect place. Write whatever you want. Start drawing,
Mm.
and that can start to open up that window of tolerance for discomfort linked to being seen or being judged as less than perfect.
Oh, you said two things that I want to touch on. So the first one being, why do you think people begin to see themselves as not human?
Mm. So I don't know if people are completely conscious that they're doing that,
Mm,
but that's what they're doing when they are pushing themselves to show up as perfect and get things right every single time, because as humans we're just not set up in that way. So I don't know whether people are conscious that they're dehumanizing themselves
mm,
when they do that, but I would encourage people to look at it through that lens,
mm,
and it will feel uncomfortable. And maybe kind of start asking yourself, where does this come from? Whose
mm.
standards are these? Because we're not born with those standards or
Yeah,
expectations.
yeah.
Like, whose are these? Are they mine? Are they someone else's generationally? And be curious about that. So to answer your question, I don't know whether people would say that they believe that they're not human. And a lot of the time, perfectionists would say that they're not perfectionists
Hmm.
because they don't believe that they're perfect. So how can I be a perfectionist if I'm not perfect? But
Right.
actually, that therein lies the perfectionism, because you believe you can never achieve the level that you want to achieve, the painfully high standards.
Hmm. There's a lot to no, there's a lot in that. I'm like,
Be like,
yeah, there's a lot in that, and I think even for myself, there's a lot to take from that. I'd never really
yeah,
thought of perfectionism as not seeing yourself as human, but I guess it is because it's not allowing yourself just to be in your
yeah,
existence, right? If you're constantly expecting performance from yourself, that's also probably down to lack of self-acceptance, because why don't you just
mm,
accept yourself as is? Why do you constantly need to push? So I think that
mm.
will resonate with a lot of people. The second one that I wanted to touch on was, I mean, the work that you're doing, it seems like it's something that requires a lot of time, resources. How exactly do people go about this? Because I mean, even if you did have the resources, you can't. We would love to obviously like talk to you every week or every day. I think for some people that would be like the ideal setup, and just start to like process this trauma and unravel and become messy. But what is your
Mm.
advice? Like, how do people live and heal at the same time with limited resources?
I feel like the healing is in the living, because there's only, not to discount what happens in therapy,
Mm,
but you see your therapist 50 minutes a week or 50 minutes every other week, and the rest of the time you're living. And that's where the real work takes place,
mm,
because you're not avoiding your activation points or your triggers. And that is where the real change happens.
mm,
So, the therapy session, you're using that therapist as a resource for all of this information that we're talking about now. Um, and some of this information is available online. Now we have social media, and there will be some things that you can do outside of work with a therapist.
mm,
But the real healing and doing happens a lot of the time outside of the therapy room, which can feel daunting because you're on your own. But all of these changes that you see as the person going through the healing process, you're the person who's driving it. As a therapist, there are things that I can do with my clients, but really it's on them to be able to take what they've learned and what they know in these sessions and go and do it in their world. I can't do that for them,
mm,
you know? And so I would encourage people to acknowledge that. That's that compassion side of the
mm,
accountability and the compassion. Accountability, you're turning up to therapy or doing the work or journaling or whatever it is. You're going out of your comfort zone,
mm,
safely going out of your comfort zone. And the compassionate part is understanding that you are doing it. I tell so many clients when they come back and they're like, "Oh, I don't really know if," and I'm like, "You're doing it though.
mm,
Look at what you're
mm,
telling me. You're doing
mm,
it. The small shifts are happening. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. Understand that these will happen in baby steps, and it's supposed to happen like that." So yeah, acknowledging that life, I don't want to say test, but I just can't think of a better word to use. But life is the test. This
yeah.
is where the work happens. How you ride these waves and these fluctuations. This is where you're doing it, and this is how you're changing your brain chemistry. You can't do it without the like practical element, and that's what your life is.
I love what you said, and I even had to write down when you said living is healing.
Mm,
Um, because in my mind, it suggests that if you're not healing, then you're already dead.
mm,
And yes, could be true, because it does require you'll feel alive when you're healing, right? Because then you're connecting with yourself, you're present in the moment. So if you're not healing, then are you really living? So that really
mm.
stood out to me.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of us will have learnt to avoid life. You know, we manage it in certain ways so that we avoid our triggers.
Mm,
And we micromanage things away so that it feels emotionally safe. But that doesn't allow us to heal,
mm,
because if you take all of the activation points away and all of the triggers, then how do we ever move through them? If we limit ourselves to not feeling these emotions
mm,
and instead intellectualize them, we don't feel our body. How do we allow the emotions to process? They don't. And so
mm,
that's not healing.
mm,
um, which is why, yeah, living and doing things and not avoiding things, but using your discernment
mm.
is healing for me.
I really love that. And I love the conversation that we've had. I think as a closing out point, I would just love you to talk about to what extent do you think lived experience from a therapist plays in the quality of the service or the advice that they would give to their clients?
This is an interesting question. And again, I'm going to have a biased opinion because of the way that I practice, which is quite relational.
Hmm.
I think there's a therapist for everyone. And in the same breath, I feel like the lived experience does matter
Hmm.
for people who are looking for relational experiences in therapy. And in my experience, um, if you are someone who is, I guess, kind of Black or from a marginalized group, then I feel like lived experience is really important because they are unique experiences that aren't often taught or discussed at length in therapeutic training.
Hmm.
And so I feel like having a therapist who has some experience in that area is priceless if you're looking to work relationally. And for me, I work relationally. So whilst I don't believe that I have to have had gone through every single experience to help a client,
Hmm.
there are some areas that I believe I can add extra value because I will have some knowledge of what that feels like.
Hmm.
So there isn't a blanket rule.
Yeah.
That feels like a bit of a politician's answer. But I feel I can see the value in it.
Yeah.
Um, but I wouldn't say it's a blanket rule.
Okay. And do you think in those circumstances, empathy will play a huge role, like where you haven't experienced something for you to like extrapolate and put yourself in your client's shoes? Like, how do you then navigate something that you haven't been through?
Yeah, I think empathy is huge um, in those instances and being open. And also, when you come away as a therapist, when you come away from that session, you have to be very curious about what's going on for you.
Mm,
Because when you haven't lived through something, there's a lot of space for judgment
mm,
because you don't have a frame of reference for it. And so when you're working with someone who has a lived experience that you've had no contact with, you have to continue to ask questions about what's coming up for you, which is why
mm,
you would use supervision. And I think that area is really important for
mm.
therapists to kind of keep on at and work with.
I love that. Don't worry, I liked your politician answer. I really, I really
You
do.
can see me trying to like toe the line, like
No, I think you gave a great answer. We are about to wrap up, but this has been so insightful, and I really think that our listeners will take value in a lot of what you've said. You've given us a lot to think about, the journal prompts to also go back and just help us process our emotions. But is there anything that you would love to leave with anybody who's listening to this? I think I am going to title this like something around living is healing because that really stood out for me.
yeah.
Is there anything that you would like to leave with people from whatever perspective that suits you?
Yeah, I would just encourage people to, if they haven't started their own healing journey, two things. Is one, they probably have started it already if they're even thinking about it. So give
Mm,
themselves that grace and understand that just by thinking about it, you have already begun.
mm,
But also encourage people to take the next step. And know that if you're looking for a therapist, there are lots of different ways that you can access therapy and therapeutic content now.
mm,
So you can, if they're based in the UK,
mm,
they can do a Google search for low cost counseling or free counseling in their area. And that can open up a whole host of organizations that don't have the like finance for huge marketing and aren't that well known.
mm,
So there'll be pockets of services for people to access if they don't have the kind of financial backing to see a private therapist. But I would encourage people to go and have a look for therapy that is them shaped. something that resonates with them personally.
Hmm. I love that. I think that's a great way to end, because at the end of the day, it has to be something that resonates with you, or else I guess you're
Yeah.
not going to follow through and do it. And also finding somebody that resonates with you too, because I do think that that's important.
Yeah.
Danielle, thank you so much for
Thank
this
you.
podcast episode. It's been amazing to speak to you and gain your insights on such an important topic. I'm pretty sure we're going to have you back again in the future, because I think that we could have spoken about a lot of things, but because
Yeah.
I don't want us to chew the listeners' ears off, I had to keep it short and brief in some parts, which I would have loved
Yeah.
to extract from. But I definitely hope that we'll see you again on the Lantern
Absolutely.
podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, and I would love to come back.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of the Lantern podcast. If you've gotten this far, please don't forget to subscribe. We're available on all platforms: YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. See you guys on the next one. Bye.